but this will be mostly a review and sort of a synthesis of what we've covered so far. As far as announcements for the course, I have finished grading the week 3 analysis, and they were pretty good. So take a look at the feedback there. Otherwise, we didn't have an exploration this week, so nothing to look at in that regard. However, this week we do have the final project, which is sort of a culmination of the month, but it's sort of a hands-on project with using Adobe Photoshop. So if anybody listening to the archive, or if you haven't kept up with the Adobe Photoshop practice activities, which I think you're on top of, it would be good to catch up with those or to revisit some of them if it's been a little while since you've tried some of the techniques, because you're going to be applying the techniques that you've covered in Photoshop in the project this weekend. But it's also not just a Photoshop activity, but it also integrates some of the aesthetic principles that we've covered. So ideas of composition, of color theory, color psychology, and even emotional design, because you're going to be creating what's essentially an ad design, similar to what we have been looking at with We Love Ad, but of course much more simple in the scope, because I'm not looking for anybody to be graphic artists at this point in the program. So just applying the Photoshop skills that you've gained this month, and putting together an ad design. So I want you to consider the composition in terms of use of the rule of thirds, use of leading lines, of visual hierarchy especially, and also consider color theory and the use of color. You'll be picking an image and modifying it, but you now know how to modify the color of an image. You know how to crop and rotate and resize the image, and also how to add elements and take away elements to change the focus and the emphasis of an image. So think of how you can apply those techniques to create an interesting and effective design. Again, I'm not looking for anyone to be a great artist with this at this point in time, so don't worry about the artistry of it, but just try to apply the ideas that we've covered this month. Did you have any questions or concerns at this point? Okay, great. And I do like to go over the analysis activities from the previous week, just to make sure all of the points are clear, and if there's anything that came up in any of the feedback that I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of. So we were looking at the You Cannot Hide an Ad again from the Denver Ad Club, and this time in terms of composition. So earlier we looked at the color aspects of the design and the use of the warm colors versus the cool colors, and how that contrast really drove home the kind of the tension and the drama that's happening within the design. Now we're looking at how the objects in the design are arranged and how that arrangement affects the message and the overall impact of how the design works. All of this was staged probably on a set. This is a photograph. So they've set this up to create the particular scene that they wanted. We were looking at the idea of visual balance first, and typically balance would be determined by dividing the composition in half and weighing the two halves. In this case, as I think most everyone pointed out, there's a little bit more visual weight shifted to the right, with the staircase being a large object as well as the young man. And the text also is one thing that I commented on in my feedback, was all the text is shifted to the right, aligned towards the right. So it gives a little bit more weight in that direction. You do have the shadow and the exit sign on the left, but really doesn't quite counterbalance all the stuff that's on the right. You could also divide it in half vertically, so top and bottom, in which case the bottom is a little more weighty, partly because of the darker color, but also because all the text, again, is down here, along with the young man holding the laptop. Another way of looking at the balance in this composition that I don't think anybody really got into in their analysis, but it does come up sometimes, is the diagonal line of the stairway, which creates a division between the warm colors and the cool colors, the area above the stairs and that below, which really is a major theme in the design, because you do have that warm color that's sort of invading the space, and the cool colors that are the shadows that are already in this kind of secluded area. So it's an unorthodox way of looking at balance, but it does play a part in this composition. You also have the major characters, the shadow and the young man, one in each of those areas. And there was also the use of the rule of thirds. And this one, I don't really consider there to be a right or wrong answer with this one, but I'm mainly looking in the analysis to see that you have an idea of what the rule of thirds is all about and what it recommends. But in looking at this, I tend to gravitate towards the idea that it is applied because the two characters, the shadow and the young man, are aligned in a way that puts them in juxtaposition to one another, away from the center. And that's really what matters with the rule of thirds. Not that they be exactly aligned with these lines, but that they be kind of offset away from the center. So it's not just a portrait of this particular object. It's more of a drama that's happening. And by putting them, the shadow is in this rectangular space of light that roughly aligns with the left hand 1/3, and the young man is positioned right around the intersection of the lower right. Kind of emphasizes the tension between those two characters. They're put in very literal juxtaposition to one another. And the use of leading lines, and this is something I think for the most part, everyone had a good idea of how the leading lines worked. The stairway are the most obvious use of leading lines, with the handrail and the line of the stairs kind of taking us down and pointing us towards the shadow. And there's also the lines in the wall that also carry us into the composition. So it all pulls the eye towards initially this space over here, roughly around the shadow, and then we drop down to the hiding place below. So it's sort of that guided tour of the composition. We're directed where to look. And even the text itself can provide a sort of leading line, because we read from left to right in the English language, and that would take us from where the stairs end right to the hiding place on the right. So kind of very subtle use of leading lines, but they are in there. And the important thing about leading lines is that they should move your eye in a meaningful way. So it's not just any line in an image is a leading line. It's just those that take us to some key focal point. You see this, actually this technique used really extensively in film as well. I was just looking earlier today at a video about how Stanley Kubrick in his films used leading lines and one-point perspective to kind of carry the viewer into space, like into the scene, in movies like Full Metal Jacket and The Shining. with those long hallway scenes where it's kind of recedes into the background. And whoops, let me go back. And the last idea was the visual hierarchy. And this is where things get kind of tricky, because visual hierarchy is based on the relative dominance of each object in the composition. And the important thing is that when you think about what object is dominant, is what is this designer trying to show me? What are they trying to draw my eye to intentionally, and what helps convey the story or the message? And with that in mind, if you look at what is highlighted, you'll see it's the shadow. Those two characters, they're purposely highlighted. The shadow has this very bright rectangular kind of frame around it, and that's because we presume there's a stair or a doorway up here off stage, and that's shining in, and the doorway creates this rectangle. But visually, just going on what we can actually see, it's this very bright highlight around the shadowy figure, and that's one of the brightest objects in the image, aside from maybe that little light bulb. So it's probably the most dominant in terms of what is highlighted, what's calling our attention. And the young man has the pale blue spotlight that's shining on him. And this was obviously very deliberately done. If you were hiding in a dark stairway, you would be in complete darkness. There wouldn't be this convenient blue light on you. But because they wanted to call attention to this character and make sure he's noticed, they put that light within the composition. Some other things that stand out: the "You Cannot Hide It" text itself is pretty large and has good contrast with the background. And then some of these larger elements, the logo and text elements at the bottom. So it creates that hierarchy. And if I were ranking this, I would probably put the shadow first, just because of that bright frame, the young man, and the "You Cannot Hide It" text. Although sometimes I tend to look at these as sort of a joint object. They're connected. The "You Cannot Hide It" ties into the young man because he kind of represents the you in the "You Cannot Hide It," since he's the one that's hiding the ideas. And then that gives way to the 5-0 logo down here and some of the smaller pieces. So it's kind of, it goes in steps from most to least dominant. Any thoughts or questions on any of that from last week? Okay, so we have looked at a lot of different separate ideas, but they were all focused on this overall idea of the aesthetics, which is remembering the definition from back in week 1, aesthetics being the perceptual reaction to media elements and how they interact with one another. So we have looked at the emotional design that goes into selecting imagery, the use of color for visual impact, as well as the use of color for psychological impact or emotional impact. And then finally, the composition or arrangement of the elements for effective delivery of the message. And these things are not all they don't all work in isolation, they all work together. So looking at, even going back to this image, you can see that the dominance is based on color contrast, which is an aspect of color theory. The color psychology, the subdued blues correspond with the emotions depicted on the face of the character. and also the warm color being connected with this invader, this person that's kind of the aggressor. It all ties together to create an overall impression, an overall message. And that's really the way to look at this, not as separate topics that we've covered from week to week, but as an overall idea of how you can compose your media to make the most impact. So anytime you are creating, especially any kind of visual media, whether it's photography or video, film, graphic design or web design, these are choices that you'd want to consider up front before you even touch the mouse or pick up the camera. These are very early conceptual ideas. So we can imagine that somebody was assigned this task of creating ad designs for the Denver Ad Club's the Denver 50 event, and they were basing all of this on the idea, this slogan, "We'll find your ideas and we'll make them famous." So you could have gone in any number of directions with that, from an art direction or a creative direction standpoint. I think of the idea of making them famous, kind of bringing up images of the red carpet, like the Grammys or the Oscars, and that sort of glitz and glamour aspect of Hollywood. But these designers instead went with more of the suspense thriller, really out of the box thinking. It's something that really is not the obvious choice. And then once you make those early decisions, you can start selecting, what imagery do I want to use? What images do I need to collect or create in order to convey that idea and that message to my audience? And we looked at how color creates that subtle influence on the moods as well, with The Matrix and Breaking Bad, and how those color was used in very subtle ways. I compare it often to the musical score because they're always there. You're just not always attuned to it as the audience, but it's still playing a part in what you're feeling and what you're experiencing. And finally, once those choices are made, you put it all together. One thing I want to emphasize is that this applies to any form of visual media. We in this class, I have a really heavy emphasis on advertising, but mostly that's just because advertising applies it very effectively. You can really see obvious examples of visceral design, the use of sex appeal, or the use of reflective design, as well as the other factors of color and composition. They're very apparent in advertising, but these also are present in all the media I've named before, of film and video, in photography. In fact, the rule of thirds comes from photography originally. So don't think of this only in terms of advertising. I sometimes see that that seems to be the impression when I see the reflection videos at the end of the month, but I really want this to be media neutral. And if there's one major takeaway I would like for you to have from the class, it would be to develop a critical eye for media as you're experiencing media out in the world, regardless of where it is or what it is. It could be the commercials or the TV shows, or even the billboards on the streets, that you continue to dissect it and kind of pick it apart and ask why these choices were made and why it was designed the way it was. Did you have any questions or thoughts on anything that we've talked about? So moving forward, and I believe as an online student, you will have a few months of general education classes from here, things like English composition and technical writing and so forth. But don't lose this content. Keep it in the back of your mind. And because coming up, you're going to encounter classes like graphic design and digital video, as well as web design, and some others that are going to be a direct continuation of the ideas that we've covered. So you'll want to still be able to apply these ideas within within those courses, and of course your portfolio project courses. In Portfolio Project 2, you're going to be applying color theory again, so you'll be revisiting all of this content. And I keep asking if you have any questions, but or any other concerns. Doesn't have to be specifically about the course. Okay. You only need one video for all the projects for professionalism. You will need a single reflection video for the professionalism activity. So it's just your reflection on the month, and that's all that's required. Yes, yeah, the reflection is for the month as a whole, not necessarily specific um, assignments, but just your experience throughout the month. And okay, yes.